Hello, this is the Bureau of Lost Culture. I'm Stephen Coates. Now, here at the Bureau, we spend our time digging up, unearthing, dusting down, bringing back into the light half-remembered, lost countercultural stories, and we often hear about the British underground alternative scene of the 60s and 50s and 70s. But our roots actually lie in the Soviet Union. Our big project, the X-Ray Audio Project, was dedicated to the amazing story of forbidden music cut onto X-rays. In the Cold War era in the Soviet Union is where we started. And so I'm very pleased that we are going back for a visit there today. Was there a counterculture in the Soviet Union? Was there youth culture in the Soviet Union? Was that possible under such a repressive regime? It was. We heard a few episodes ago from Teria Tomitsu about the Soviet hippie movement. And today we are welcoming a very special guest who's going to walk us through a quick survey of the counterculture in the Soviet Union. He is the person who, as far as I'm aware, wrote first of all about X-Ray Records in his wonderful book back in the USSR, The True Story of Rock in Russia. I think that was back in the 80s. And that's a wonderful survey of the way that the Russian rock bands who emerged in the 70s and 80s contributed in some way to the cultural upheaval of perestroika. He also wrote a couple of years ago another wonderful survey, Subcultura, the story of Russian and Soviet subcultures. He is, and was, and is a broadcaster and a DJ, a kind of Soviet John Peel, always bringing new music to the masses, a cultural trader, as they might say in Russia. He has been and remains an academic, a writer, a broadcaster, I'd say somewhat of a provocateur as well. He is an old friend. He helped us immensely with the X-Ray Audio Project. And I'm very pleased to welcome him here today, Artemyi Troistsky.
And a family man.
And a family man. That's what they always say on Twitter, isn't it? I was thinking that on the way here. They always say, like, I am a oligarch, arms trader, and proud dad. So welcome, Art.
Thank you.
It's very nice to see you here back here after all this time. For anybody who doesn't know who you are, let's have a brief bio. Where were you born and when?
I was born in 1955 in the city of Yaroslavl, which is a smaller scale city, 300 kilometers, which is like 200 miles north of Moscow. But I've only spent a few months there, and then I was moved to Moscow. So I also may be considered a Muscovite, although I lived in Prague for 5 years between 63 and 68. And I also lived in London for almost 1 year in 89 and 1990. And, I've started the first disco in Moscow at the Moscow State University in 1972 when I was only 17.
No, we better stop right there because that's we've already gone in quite deep. But the first thing you said, which was interesting, is that you spent time in Prague in the 60s when you were a kid. So I'm assuming from that your parents, in some ways, were part of that class of Soviet citizens who were allowed to travel abroad, if not to the West.
Yes, well, I think that my parents, my dad in particular, he did belong to the kind of lower grade Soviet nomenclature. He was a political scientist, an historian, and he was sent to Prague because it was Prague where the main magazine for communist and socialist intellectual research was situated. So the magazine was called Problems of Peace and Socialism, and my father worked there in the Latin American section, and he was a very rare case of a Soviet new left, a Soviet kind of Trotskyite lefty. He was friends with, real friends, he knew him personally, friend of Che Guevara.
Wow.
And Fidel Castro. He knew them.
Did you meet them?
No, I've never met them. But I've met, thanks to my father, I've met some other interesting Latin American people like Gabriel Garcia Marquez. He even stayed at our place when he once came to Moscow for a film festival.
So you got a very, I mean, it may still have been in that kind of broad Eastern Bloc communist part of Europe, but you did get exposure then outside Russia, outside the main bulk of the Soviet Union when you were a kid. So that must have opened up your eyes a bit.
Yes, well, this has helped me a great deal because in Prague we've been living in an international community, and thanks to my schoolmates from France and from Italy, who also belong to those kind of communist families, I first heard rock music. And of course I was much more exposed to the cultural information that I needed. And I became a dedicated rock fan since the age of 8, I'm afraid.
Right.
In 1963, in the autumn, we went on holidays to a children's camp, and my French friends, they've brought some records there, some singles by the Beatles and Beach Boys and the Rolling Stones and some French artists of the same kind of that period. And I loved this music from the first hearing. And then I started to learn English myself. I'm self-taught. I don't have any professional education in English language. I've studied English by translating songs by the Beatles. I mean, I've listened to records, and I put English lyrics there, just phonetically, and then I try to translate them, and then sometimes I've also got magazines. And this is how I've learned English.
You taught yourself English through rock and roll in some ways, right? It's interesting, isn't it? Because obviously for anybody who grew up here, particularly in recent decades, got absolutely no idea what that was like to be born and grow up in the Soviet Union in the 60s. Were you aware at the time when you're in Prague, you're listening to rock and roll records and maybe, you're mingling with this international community, were you aware at the time that this was a bit rare and a bit of a privilege possibly for a typical Soviet kid?
Well, I didn't think about it at all, but the situation in the Czech Republic, then Czechoslovakia, a non-existent country now, it was pretty liberal. They've had live music rock clubs there. And they had some records on sale, mostly by local bands, but also sometimes imported rock records. And when I returned to Moscow, and this was in the spring of 1968, shortly before the Soviet invasion to Czechoslovakia in August 68. When I returned to Moscow, of course, I found the situation there completely different. And for the first couple of years of my living in Moscow, I was very depressed because I didn't have friends. I was writing letters to my pen friends, from Prague, from Italy, from Canada, and so on. But gradually, step by step, I have met, some kindred spirits. I mean, right. I suddenly started to see long-haired guys and trendy girls in the streets of Moscow, and I spoke with them, and this is how I got involved in the local scene. Also found out that yes, there are also rock concerts in Moscow, not as interesting as in the Czech Republic, because at that time, late 60s, early 70s, all Moscow and St. Petersburg, Leningrad, of course, bands, they've been playing only cover versions of their favorite Beatles and Stones or Cream songs. But, this is how I got involved with the local scene. And when I graduated from school and became a student, I started this first disco in Moscow, where I played vinyl records.
These are records that you brought back from Czechoslovakia.
I've brought some records from Prague, but also, of course, I became very much involved in the Moscow black market.
Right, we'll talk about that in a second.
Which was an interesting phenomenon.
Sure. So, I mean, the background for this, for anybody who doesn't know, obviously, is that, all culture is censored and restricted in the Soviet Union. I mean, it had got a bit easier in the 60s in the kind of Khrushchev-Thaw era, and then Brezhnev came back, it sort of toughened up a bit. I mean, you talked about the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in 68. That was partly, wasn't it, because of the liberalization that was going on in Czechoslovakia and Prague, and the sort of Soviets went in to kind of nip that in the bud.
Yes, they wanted to build the so-called socialism with a human face in Czechoslovakia. But unfortunately, this bright idea has failed because of brotherly help from the mighty Soviet Union.
So you met some fellow travelers, some fellow souls in Moscow. Interestingly, a couple of months ago, we had Terry Tamitsu, I think you've maybe come across, who made the documentary Soviet Hippies.
Yes, I've seen this film, yeah.
So, of course, I mean, that was a bit of an eye-opener for us anyway, the notion that there were hippies in Moscow. But, of course, there were. There was an underground even then, right? Even in the tough years, there was always some sort of underground going on, wasn't there?
Well, I think that we've had underground in Russia all the time. It's omnipresent. I mean, in the 19th century, we've also had the nihilistic underground. And then, of course, in the beginning of the 20th century, we've had this decadent and futuristic underground. And even in the toughest of times, I mean, the really scary and maximum cruel time of Stalin, there was some underground activities. I mean, there was a youth political underground, which unfortunately was very, very badly repressed, and some members of this underground, still teenagers, have been executed, even.
We don't hear so much
to death.
We don't hear so much about that. I mean, maybe you could tell us a little bit more about that.
It's a very, very little known story which needs a lot of investigation. But unfortunately, in the contemporary Russia, no one is interested in investigating this story because, on one hand, these anti-Stalinist circles, Kruzhki circles, they were known. They've been all Leninists. Or Trotsky. They were lefties. So the traditional liberal Democrats, they are not interested in that because they are lefties. And the contemporary Russian so-called lefties, the communists, are all Stalinists, so therefore they also don't want to talk about anti-Stalinist underground.
And these were young people who, despite the terrifying culture at the time, were still able to or attempting to make some sort of countercultural protest.
Oh yes, we are talking about the famous Stilyagi here. Yes, the swing Jugend of the Soviet Union. Yes, Stilyagi were born out of, they were like the children of World War II, when, as some people still remember, Soviet Union, United States of America, and Britain have been allies. And in the 40s, during the war, and in the first couple of years after the war, there's been plenty of Western culture available in the Soviet Union. American clothes, American records, American and British films were shown in Soviet theaters, and they've been hugely popular with the trendy young people. And then, of course, in 1948, Churchill and Stalin have started the Cold War, and the Iron Curtain fell down. But, some youngsters, they wanted the party to be continued. And they kept listening to big bands, to swing jazz. and they copied American clothes style, and they were calling themselves Stilyagi. And although ideologically they were not charged, I mean, they didn't care about capitalism, socialism, whatever. They just wanted to dance. They wanted to look cool and to have fun. So therefore, Stilyagi were not as severely prosecuted as the political underground kids.
I mean, if anybody else,
but still, they were ridiculed in the Soviet press, and they've been a target of all kinds of ideological condemnation.
If people want to know more about that, Valery Todorovsky's film Stilyagi, which is translated as Hipsters, which is kind of all right, isn't it? Followers of fashion.
Yeah, it's okay, and the film is good.
The film
is good. It's a fantasy film. It's not a historical film, but
it captures the spirit maybe of the times.
It does.
In some way.
It does, and it captures the spirit. It captures the style, and Todorovsky is a friend of mine, and I'm a big fan of his films in general.
It's like a Baz Luhrmann film, isn't it? It's a musical. Yeah, it's
like a La La Land with a political touch.
It is, yeah. But interestingly for us, talking to you, but also talking to some old guys in Russia in the last couple of years who were Stilyagi, perhaps, and then some people who weren't. They were sort of looked down on by the intelligentsia as well, not just by the kind of party types, because they were seen as, in some ways, by some people as being rather superficial, shallow, just interested in dancing and drinking. But that's what, young people do,
Yeah, that's absolutely true. My parents were like this. I mean, generation-wise, they belonged to the Stilyagi generation, but they were young intellectuals studying at the historical faculty of the Moscow State University, and they despised Stilyagi for exactly being too apolitical, ignorant of serious literature, ideology, and so on. I mean, they thought that, they're just silly kids who know nothing in life except for drinking, dancing, and having a good time.
So, I mean, we're going to come back to music in a second, but just before we do, I'd like just to hear a little bit more about not the Stilyagi, but these other people that you referred to. This is the young, politically motivated underground who were taking a very brave stance. I mean, just tell us, you said this is a forgotten story, Art, but just tell us about those people.
Well, we've had about, I have counted about 30 to 40 underground student organizations which existed in the Soviet Union from the late 40s till more or less Stalin's death in 1953. And they existed not only in Moscow and Leningrad, but also in Voronezh and Stalingrad and many smaller cities of the Soviet Union. In some areas of the Soviet Union, they've also had a nationalistic flavor to them, like in the Baltic Soviet republics or in Belarus and the Ukraine. But their mainstream ideology was Marxism, and their main message was that Stalin is not a communist. He's not a true communist. He's not a Marxist, and Stalinism is a awful fascist mutation of socialist ideas.
A perversion of Marx, in fact.
Yes. So they've been all for Lenin, but all against Stalin. This was their common ideology. And they were very young kids. I mean, they were school kids of the older grades or university and college students. And some of them, well, most of these organizations, they have been detected by the KGB and put to jail, including school kids. I mean, it's amazing things. They've put school kids to jail, and these school kids, they were worrying that they are not having their lessons, and they asked their roommates or checkmates at the prison, could they please teach them some mathematics. Very touching. And some of them have been killed. And it's really is a tragic story and tragically under-investigated.
I mean, one of many tragedies from that time, and that was through into the 1960s, was it?
Well, I think most of those kids, they have been amnested right after Stalin died, because they were like 17, 18. There were also girls among them, so they were among the first to be put under amnesty when Khrushchev came to power.
So Khrushchev comes to power, there's the cultural thaw. But to return to you and back to Moscow in the late 60s and just before you really get going, Brezhnev's back in, the sort of pressure's on again, isn't it, somewhat? But this is the time when you're meeting fellow like-minded souls who grew their hair, wear cool clothes. And Moscow wasn't just this grey place that it was kind of projected to be here. It was quite swinging in some ways, wasn't it?
Well, of course, if you compare it to swinging London and Carnaby Street and so on, it was much more grey. But still, if you knew right places and right people, one could have some fun in Moscow, like at those underground rock concerts or at My Disco, which existed for 2 years, from 72 till 74.
So you've come back from Czech Republic. You've got a very cool record collection by comparison with many of your peers. You like music, you know about music and stuff. So how did you get to set up this disco, as you call it?
Well, I think it has started because of my involvement in the black market. And in the black market, of course, well, the black market is not really a market. It's not a place with stalls and everything. Black market is a network. It's a network of people who buy, sell, and swap things. And the main items circulating in this black market were A, clothes, like jeans and all kinds of trendy Western style clothes. B, American cigarettes, Marlboros and Kents and Winstons and so on. C, hard currency, which was the riskiest business of all. And D, and this was where I was, of course, involved, Western records. And Western records, new albums, the singles were almost not on sale there because, there was no singles scene in the Soviet Union. New albums by, the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, and later Jimi Hendrix and Frank Zappa and Pink Floyd and Led Zeppelin and The Doors and so on. And they costed a fortune. So it was quite difficult to buy these records. What I've done is I usually swapped these records, but because of that black market music community, I've met some guys who like the stories that I told them. I mean, all average music lovers, underground music lovers in the Soviet Union at that time, many of them didn't speak English at all, and they did not have any information. All they had were records. So they knew the names of the musicians, but they didn't know, their stories. They didn't know, the whole context of of rock music. And I was one of the very few, maybe the only, who could tell them stories. Okay, yes, I said, yes, this is Jethro Tull. Jethro Tull is Ian Anderson on flute and so on. And blah, blah, started to tell them the story of Jethro Tull or, whoever, Captain Beefheart. And they asked me, why don't I do lectures about music? Why wouldn't I play these records? And then I said, well, there is a form like that. It's called discotheques, and I saw them, and I was there at discotheques in Prague. But they don't really tell stories. They play records and kids dance to them. But I can make a hybrid disco. And this was exactly what I've done. In the first part of this disco, in the kind of intellectual part, I've told the story of certain particular band. I remember the first band that I played there was my favorite band of that period, and they were King Crimson. So I told a story about King Crimson, and I've also shown slides made from album covers and photos from magazines and so on. And this has lasted for 1 hour, and then for remaining 2-3 hours I just played music to dance to.
That's funny because
this is how my disco looked.
When we did that event together in Tel Aviv with the Museum of Art, you did the same thing. I remember you gave a sort of lecture about the Soviet underground, and then you played the tunes afterwards, and everybody danced.
Yeah, exactly.
Good. I'm glad that you're still at it. But that's funny. So you invented a form there, a particular form, the kind of academic disco.
Yes, well, I wouldn't say it was only my invention. As I said, it was a popular demand. The kids wanted to have information about their beloved musics, and I said, okay, well, I can do this.
Right. So I guess it's a little bit like, I'm assuming, in the age of the internet and the YouTube, none of this stuff is relevant, of course, anymore. But at that time, a bit like we thought here, or the way that Hollywood stars were thought of as here, I guess these musicians from this far-off Western land who were making this music would have seemed like some mythological creatures or something. And so you were able to actually flesh that out a little bit and tell their stories, right?
Yes, well, I think this was so. And, of course, before the VHS video appeared, American and British films have been far less known to trendy young Russians than music, because in order to see a movie, you have to go to a movie theater, right. And very few Western films were shown in the Soviet Union. And usually the films that were shown, they were like French comedies or Italian comedies, things like that. So almost no American films have been shown, and no serious British films have been shown. And therefore it was music that became more important than Hollywood or Monty Python or things like that in the Soviet Union. The film era started with the VHS. Then we all could see at last all the movies we've only read about, like One Flew Over Cuckoo's Nest or Blow Up or Zabriskie Point or Easy Rider, whatever.
So let's talk about why this was underground. So this music, of course, is not officially available, even if it's not actually sort of repressed. So these events that you were putting on, these discos, where were they and how did you organize them if they were sort of underground or unofficial? And was there a risk in doing so? A risk from the authorities?
Well, I can tell you that technically and legally it was very simple and very easy. I've had my discos at the Moscow State University at one of the cafes in the main, this Stalinist skyscraper, the main building of the Moscow State University. So there was a cafe on the 4th floor, And I've organized my discotheques there, and there was absolutely no bureaucracy about that. It was just like student leisure. But after 2 years, the Komsomol bosses. Komsomol is Young Communist League, the communist organization that supervised Russian young people. Some Komsomol functionaries came to my disco, and they said that you are playing Western music here, which is not good, and we demand that you submit your whole repertoire to us. And I said, okay, I can give you the list of artists. Okay, I can give you even the list of songs that I play. And they said, but we also need these lists exactly in the consequence in which you play them, and with short annotations of each song, so we could know what do they sing about there. And then I said, no, this I cannot do. So this is how I had to close down my disco after 2 years of its existence.
So you would have had to, say, take a song like A Day in the Life, for instance, by the Beatles, and sort of write.
Well, I didn't play A Day in the Life because it's not a dance song.
Okay, but
well, about A Day in the Life, I could put there something. A song about alienation and about traffic accident in London where a guy got
somebody blew his own head, his head off. So you had to sort of try and you were expected to do some exposition on a kind of groovy dance tune.
Yes. But so what could I? How could I put an annotation about, say, James Brown's sex machine or something?
Very short annotation. Okay, so in parallel art, so you mentioned earlier that the Soviet, the young Russian bands at the time, they're the ones that are interested in sort of rock and roll and stuff. They're actually all covers bands. They're all sort of imitating the Beatles and the Stones, playing cover songs. At what point did you start?
Yes, and very often they even didn't understand what they sang about because they didn't speak English at all. So they've just repeated these songs phonetically.
Right. So at what point did, an interesting, original, young Soviet bands start to emerge, or when did you start to notice them?
Well, we've had before underground rock music. We've had a whole movement in the Soviet Union of the so-called bardic songs.
Amazing stuff, yeah.
Vysotsky and these bards, yes,
Galich,
they are what you call here singer-songwriters who sang to acoustic guitars. Their music was pretty primitive, but their voices were very interesting. And
very powerful poetic lyrics.
Yes, above all, they've had fantastic lyrics. So they also may be called singing poets. And this whole movement started more or less at the same time as this folk movement in America, like Pete Seeger, Bob Dylan, Joan Baez, and so on, in the mid-50s. And they became, some of them became hugely popular, like Vladimir Vysotsky, Alexander Galich, Bulata Kudjava. They've been darlings of the young intelligentsia. And I think that this generation of singer-songwriters, they've influenced a lot the first generation of Russian language rock bands. And here, I think the most important band and the most important author was a band called Machina Vremeni, Time Machine, and their frontman and main singer and lyricist named Andrei Makarevich. He also played the lead guitar in the band. So they've started to in Leningrad, the same role has been played by a band called Sankt Peterburg, led by Vladimir Rekshan, also a poet. He later became a professional novelist, also a poet and a singer and a guitarist. So the interesting thing about those songs was that they were not protest songs, they were not political songs. I mean, comparing to Vysotsky or especially Galich, songs of Mashina Vremeni are really innocent. And there was no political or ideological agenda in them. But at the same time, they were completely in opposition to official Soviet pop music, because official Soviet pop music, including the songs of so-called vocally instrumental ensembles, which was like the official form of rock music in the Soviet Union in the late 60s and the 70s. These official pop songs, they had to fully reflect the official cultural doctrine, which is to be optimistic, life-affirming. Of course, there were also straight songs about communist ideology and the party and Lenin and great patriotic war and so on.
You can write a pop song about that?
Well, we've had hundreds of pop songs dedicated to ideological matters, and some of them were written by really great composers, and they may be heard even now because of their great melodies.
Right.
Although, of course, their lyrical content is totally outdated. The songs of Mashina Vremeni and similar bands, they've been completely different, because they've sang about frustrations of young people. They sang about being lonely, being alienated. They sang about alcohol and even drugs and so on. And this, of course, was absolutely unacceptable in the context of official ideological doctrine. So because of that, these bands have not been greeted by the officialdom. They were never played on radio, let alone TV. And sometimes in the toughest of times, in the beginning of the 80s, some of them got arrested and even put to jail for. Well, of course, they couldn't officially put them to jail for singing songs, but they put them to jail, say, for illegal commercial activities and, things like that.
I mean, we should also say that there'd also been this other huge genre, I suppose, of Russian music, the Blatnaya songs, all that time, right the way back to the 20s, 30s, right? These sort of gulag songs, yard songs sung at home in the kitchens and in communal places, which were telling those stories of real life in the Soviet Union, the fighting, the criminal gangs, the life in prison, passionate love stories. That had all been going on too, hadn't it? But again, completely underground, right?
Yes, this was also an underground phenomenon, and I think that they could that they would be underground in any other country. Like, can you imagine, say, American gangster rap being performed in the 40s or the 50s in America? I think that that this is quite unlikely. They would would be stopped by the police or FBI or somebody. Yes, we did have these criminal songs, I would call them, in the Soviet Union. The thing, however, is that we were not interested in them at all. I mean, first of all, I liked the music, and I was not, Time Machine. They were not my favorite of Russian bands, although they sang interesting songs, but. I wasn't a big fan of them simply because their music was very kind of traditional and very backwards. I mean, they were like the Beatles. And at that time, I've been listening to King Crimson and then to
Beefheart and
The Clash and Talking Heads and so on. So I and most of my friends, we've been interested in music first of all. So we didn't care much about lyrics and all these things. And if I wanted brave and provocative lyrics, then I'd rather listen to Galich and Vysotsky rather than rock bands. And the criminal songs, they belong to this criminal strata of the Soviet Union, and we didn't really get along with them.
I mean, I guess it was like
I was not interested in this part of the Soviet musical underground at all.
I suppose the best way to compare it in outside the Soviet Union was the kind of narco corrida songs, right, in Mexico. Which is a big thing now, isn't it?
Yeah.
They're kind of like folk songs, but glorifying the gang and the drug culture.
Yes. I think this is an adequate parallel.
So through the 70s and 80s, you do start to champion and write about the Soviet underground rock bands, didn't you?
Yes, well, I've started, of course, all my articles from like the first 5 years of my journalistic careers, they all have been about Western music. Not necessarily the music that I liked, because I also had to write articles on demand. So I wrote articles about Elton John, and I wrote articles about, ABBA and so on. But yes, at the very end of the 70s, I also started to write about my Russian rock friends from Moscow, from Leningrad, from Estonia, and so on. And also at that time, I was involved in organizing rock concerts and even big rock festivals. The biggest of them happened in the capital of Georgia, Tbilisi, in March 1980, and this is still a legendary event called Russian Woodstock or whatever. So I was like the A&R person of this festival, and this was also the first time when underground rock bands like Machina Vremeni, Aquarium, Autograph, and some others performed legally before big audience, and they even released a double compilation album of bands of this festival, which was the first ever rock record produced in the Soviet Union.
On Melodia?
Yes, of course. We've only had one label, a state monopoly called Melodia Records.
But I mean, how did that transition work from those bands being kind of underground and having to perform sort of, semi-secret gigs, however popular they might be? How did they suddenly, the authorities say, let's have a festival and Artemyi Troistsky is going to curate it?
No, it wasn't done in this way. It was actually a private initiative between me and my Georgian friends. I've had a friend who at that time was serving as the deputy head of the Tbilisi Philharmony. And he was a jazz fan and also a rock fan, and we decided to make this festival. So it was also a very risky venture, and as I think now, the only reason why the authorities let this happen is because it was 1980, and this was the year of the Olympic Games in Moscow. So this festival has happened 3 months before the Olympics, and this was time of a micro-thaw. So the authorities, they wanted to show to the rest of the world that Soviet Union is a cultural country and it's liberal country, and we even have rock festivals if you want it. So if there were no Olympics, I'm not sure that the whole thing could happen.
So through the 80s, you carried on doing that, and you carried on actually organising underground shows. And so, I mean, how did that work? I mean, it's because, I know doing gigs and festivals, it's difficult to do it out of sight. You know, I mean, but where do you play? How do you organise the tech and all that sort of stuff and get everybody there and advertise it and let people know? I mean, it's not a straightforward thing, is it, to put on any sort of show, any sort of festival? But if you're trying to do it out of sight of the authorities and hoping that they're not going to kind of turn up at the last minute and close it all down, I mean, how do you do that?
Okay, well, there were several ways of organizing concert activity in the Soviet Union in the first half of the 80s. Of course, in the second half, we've had perestroika and glasnost and Gorby and so on, so the scene was completely different. The 80s was a decade of stark contrast between the first 5 years and the remaining 5 years. So the best situation was in the west of the Soviet Union, and by that I mean the Baltic republics, especially Estonia. In Estonia, they've had the most liberal cultural policies of all, because in Estonia people could watch Finnish television. And Finnish television was also showing rock concerts and Western movies and things like that. So the cultural officials in Estonia, they had somehow to adjust to it, to cope with it, and they've had a much more liberal approach to all things Western than we've had it in Russia, for instance. Then the second Western pinnacle of rock culture was the city of Leningrad, where in 1981 they have organized the famous Leningrad Rock Club. This was the first rock club in the Soviet Union, and it has been curated by the KGB, and this was the only way to make it legal. And the KGB, of course, they have made it possible simply because they wanted to watch closely this scene. But still, I think that this was a compromise in which KGB has lost the game. It was a cat and mouse game in which the cat has lost.
So let me understand. So the KGB is saying, okay, we're going to help put on this thing as a way of saying, well, let's get all these people out in the open so we can keep an eye on them and understand what's going on.
Yeah.
But of course, in doing so, they kind of opened the floodgates in some way.
Exactly. Yes, you are absolutely right. So Leningrad was the only city in Russia, in the Russian part of the Soviet Union, where they've had legal rock gigs at the Leningrad Rock Club. In Moscow, rock music, like in the first half of the 80s, was banned completely. All the bands have been blacklisted, not only from public performances, but also from being played on the radio and even played at the discos. And at that time, we've had plenty of discos already, and they were also, of course, curated by the Ministry of Culture, so their repertoire was very strictly followed by the censorship. So what were the possibility? The possibility number one was called kvartirnik. Kvartirnik means kvartira in Russia means apartment. So they were apartment concerts.
Right.
Concerts at private flats, concerts at country houses, the dachas, and so on. And this is how rock music lived in Moscow from 82 till the beginning of 85. And for instance, I even organized whole rock festivals at my apartment with like 4 to 5 bands playing, of course with no electric instruments, only bongos and acoustic guitars, things like that, flutes, fiddles. But whole band was playing in my apartment, which wasn't that big, but big enough for maybe 50 people to come to this festival.
So you got 4 or 5 bands, 50 audience members, and I'm assuming that your neighbours were quite tolerant, were they then?
My neighbors, both above and beyond, were my friends, and they were also present as an audience at these festivals.
Okay, so the underground's thriving in a sort of small way because you just carry on doing it out of sight wherever you can. And was this attended by the other sort of staples of rock concerts, drink and drugs art? Was that part of the scene as well?
Well, I would say that before the beginning of the 80s, drugs were not a big thing in the Soviet underground. The real drug invasion was inspired and actually technically supplied by the Afghan war. When war in Afghanistan has started, also a drug traffic from Afghanistan to Russia was provided by officers, by all kinds of war bureaucrats who came there in the back, and also by soldiers. I believe for them all this was big business. Before that, drugs were not a big thing. But drinks and alcohol, yes. Well, for Russians, alcohol is a religion, and of course, I cannot imagine Russian underground, be it a political underground or musical underground or a literary underground, without lots of booze. This was
Obligatory, yeah. You mentioned that the second half of the 80s was very different, and let's just talk a little bit about why and how. I know that your friend and the extraordinary Sergei Kuryakin and Pop Mechanica were part of that, weren't they? The sort of second half of the 80s in Leningrad-based art provocateur. And it seems to me that something very different was going on with Kuryakin and Pop Mechanica, because this felt completely original in some way. It wasn't derivative, and it wasn't particularly lyrical. It was organised chaos or something, wasn't it? I mean, it was like this Dadaist intervention. Just tell us briefly about Kuryakin, because he was a good friend of yours, wasn't he?
Yes, well, I would say that in the 80s there was a whole bunch of geniuses which Russian musical underground has produced. For me, the two main the two most talented people and real geniuses were two guys. One is Alexander Bashlachov, who was a poet, a rock bard, a passionate rock bard, but above all a great poet, a poet of the same caliber as Pushkin, Lermontov, Yesenin, Mayakovsky, and so on. He has committed suicide in 1988, and this guy was absolutely out of this world. The second incredible personality and great musician was Sergei Kuryakin, who you've just talked about. He was basically a jazz piano player, and he came to the world of, I wouldn't call it rock, to the world of musical performance from the world of avant-garde jazz. And he has created this conceptual musical monster called Popularная механика, pop mechanics, which didn't have a single similar concert in their whole career, and the career was quite long, maybe 4 or 5 years. each time they've played, it was something completely different. And Kuryokin has improvised not only musically, but he improvised with musicians, with style, with environment, and so on. So for the performances of Pop Mechanica, he could invite pop singers, all kinds of folk ensembles, classical musicians, ballet dancers, animals like goats and circus actors and so on. So I would say that that probably the closest thing to Pop Mechanica is circus. But circus is entertainment, and Pop Mechanica was quite scary, I would say.
Provocative,
provocative, paradoxal, but still kind of circus-like. And all this has been conducted by Sergei Kuryokin, who occasionally played piano, but mostly he was just running around the stage like a classical director, saying now you play, and you do this and you do that, and so on. So this was like a multi-style
performance
art,
cabaret.
I wouldn't call it a multimedia, because at that time, the videos and such things, they were not available. But yes, it was. There's a popular musical style called minimalism. So this was opposite of minimalism. This was maximalism.
Yeah. We did a show with Olivia Lichtenstein, who
oh yes,
made
I remember her.
Yeah, and about Sergei in detail. There was one particular incident which I wanted to ask you about, which I think happened after perestroika, but it seemed quite significant and maybe I think important in some way, which is, tell us about how Kuryokin perpetrated this fraud / con on the public by claiming that Lenin was a mushroom.
Yes, well, this was a TV show done by Sergei Sholokhov. So he has once invited Mr. Kuryokin, and I think also Mr. Grebenshikov, a rock man, and the frontman of Aquarium, one of the most popular Russian rock bands, and a friend of Kuryokin's, because Kuryokin used to play also in Aquarium for 2 or 3 years, played keyboards there. And this was 89 or 1990. Yes, and Kuryokin, who was a genius provocator, generally, he came up with a theory that Vladimir Lenin was actually a mushroom-type creature. And Kuryokin was a very good actor. So he would say the most incredible, the most ridiculous things with a stony face. He was like Buster Keaton. And so he was proving with all kinds of pictures, graphics, and so on, presenting them to the camera, that Lenin was a mushroom. And this was very, very, very popular concept, which immediately became legendary in the Soviet Union. Some people were worrying about that and were totally infuriated. But they were a minority, but most people found it really funny.
So people were infuriated because they found it insulting to Lenin, but there was also possibly a small minority, but there was also a sizable proportion of people who thought it was true, though, no?
No, I don't think that there were any people who thought that this that this is true. Well, except for maybe the worst, the clinical morons. But of course, the sad paradox is that a few years after that, Sergei Kuryokin also became a member and a spokesman for the Nationalist Bolshevik Party.
Well, I don't know how they how he could excuse his anti-Leninist provocations on TV, but yes, later he turned to be a Bolshevik himself.
The amazing thing about that, though, of course, is that it shows how much had changed, that you could actually have a TV show where a musician could appear and even say something like that about Lenin, right? That he was a mushroom, and not be immediately dragged off and sent to the Gulag. I mean, things had changed, hadn't they? I mean, what was that like for you to watch that dramatic 5-year period where, perestroika and glasnost came, and how did it affect the musical underground?
Well, it didn't affect the musical underground in the creative way, I would say, because all the bands who have flourished under perestroika years, they've been the bands who've started in the late 70s or the early 80s. So they've been doing the same thing, and I was doing the same thing. The difference was that before we've been doing it for a few people operating like secret agents in the underground, and later, like I've done this Chernobyl benefit concert, at the main Olympic Hall of Moscow, co-hosting it with Alla Pugacheva, the biggest ever Russian pop star, and so on. But it was the same thing, and the same people, and this same music, more or less. And of course, both the Soviet times and the Putin times, they make those free and liberal years seem absolutely unbelievable. You know that in the 90s, I was the head of music at TV channel called Russia, which was the second biggest national state-owned TV channel. And I was the head of music programming there, which sounds absolutely unbelievable these days. And I've had regular, like weekly or monthly TV shows there on experimental music, for instance, or jazz, or we've had a program called World Village, which was about all kinds of exotic, folkloric, and ethnic music. So, or programs on academic, contemporary music, and all kinds of electroacoustic experiments and so on. I mean, I've really tried to make it as culturally varied and stylistically varied as possible. Nothing like that exists on Russian TV anymore.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. So, what you're saying about the perestroika is, and the end of the Soviet crumbling of the Soviet Empire. So the underground goes overground briefly. The bands that you were involved with, Aquarium and Kino, and Kirokin's becoming a huge star, or a huge celebrity, partly because of the mushroom thing, but. And then there's this period, another thaw, I suppose, before things change. When I met you, I don't know if you remember this actually, but I think the first time we met in Russia, when I interviewed you, you had a radio show and you took a call partway through the interview from, I think, the boss of the radio station, and he was telling you that you were no longer allowed to play Ukrainian bands. Do you remember that?
Yes.
During the time of the Ukrainian conflict.
Yeah. Well, I think, well, shit happens.
You got sacked from your job at the university. You got your TV show. Your TV show got taken away.
Yes, of course. Well, I'm afraid that Russia has made a full circle and came back not even to Brezhnev's, but rather to Stalinist times. I mean, what's happening now under Putin? You may call it Stalinism light. I mean, there's no millions of people in the Gulag, but still several hundreds of political prisoners. The censorship is back in town, and unlike in the Brezhnev times, which were kind of course, stupid and nasty and old-fashioned, but at least they were quiet. Now, in Putin's Russia is aggressive, and all this propaganda of patriotism and expansion, and that we have to promote traditional values all over the world and so on. This wasn't the case under Brezhnev. I mean, they simply, they wanted to die quietly. And these guys, unfortunately, they want, to go further. And that's, I think, very dangerous.
So, cultural censorship is back, maybe with different applications. So obviously you can stop people being seen on TV or being on the media. You can stop the funding for theatre and all that sort of stuff. That's the way to do it these days, economic censorship. But in terms of, let's finish off. I mean, where is the musical underground now in Russia? I mean, it's a time, you're saying, of cultural censorship and political repression and stuff like that. So is there now a musical underground in Russia, and what is it? Where is it?
Well, I would say that there is no musical underground in the true old Soviet sense of the word. I would rather say that there is a musical ghetto right now. There are artists which are benefiting from the existing regime, which are always on TV, on radio, and so on, which are financed by the state, which participate in all kinds of official actions, like Olympic Games, all kinds of festivities in the Red Square, and so on. And there is a faction of the musical scene which only exists in small clubs and the internet and YouTube. And this is the new underground of Russian music. It's very varied. It's not only rock music. It's rock music. It's a lot of rap and hip hop. It's very political, much more political than it used to be in the Soviet times. And of course, you could never ever see or hear these artists at official level. But they do exist. There were some attempts to oppress, maybe to destroy these underground activities. At the end of 2018, there's been several bans on several bands and hip-hop acts when police forces stopped concerts, blocked clubs, and so on. And some very good groups like I Speak, for instance, or Pornofilmy, or a rapper nicknamed Husky, and so on, they have been stopped from performing. But very soon the authorities understood that this is absolutely stupid and counterproductive, because they've stopped, for instance, 200 people from going to an I Speak concert, but at the same time 40 million people watched their video, There's No More Death, the legendary Russian video of nowadays. And therefore they decided to kind of calm down the situation. So last year in 2019, I cannot recall much scandalous situations with music, but they are pushed into a corner, a rather dark and unpromoted corner of the of the musical reality, but they do exist and they feel well, and they keep being bold, young, provocative, and I think the number of audience for these bands is only growing, thanks to Mr. Putin and his fascist policy.
And a little bit to Mr. Trotsky and his radio station, which I'm going to link to in the notes for this. So there you have it. The Russian underground is alive and twitching.
Yes. I think that Russian. Well, I wouldn't call it necessarily underground. I would say that Russian opposition music is now alive and well and in a good form, and it's not only created by a young radical artists, but I think that a lot of talented classic rockers from the 70s and the 80s are also in good form now, and I'm very happy for these guys.
And we're very happy for them too, and very happy to hear from Artemyi Troistsky. Thank you, Art. And thank you to you for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. Another story from the Counterculture. We'll be back next time with even more. You can check us out in the meantime. www.bureauoflostculture.com. See ya.